What's up, everyone? In this issue of Motive Tech, we are talking about oil accumulators. Oil accumulators are probably the most misunderstood and underrated product in the performance and racing industry. Not sure why though, because we personally feel they're probably the best modification you can do to a performance engine for security reasons. Now the V8 guys have been using them for years, muscle cars, NASCAR, sprint cars, all sorts of stuff, but for some reason they haven't caught on in the Japanese and Euro market very much. Not sure why, because we've been using them in our cars for probably 6 or 7 years now with great success. Now, the accumulator gets called a poor man's dry sump sometimes, but that really is underselling what an accumulator does. So, what are they and how do they work? Now, we've got an accumulator here that we pulled down for cleaning out of our R32 GT-R after an engine failure, so we thought that would be a good chance to show you guys exactly what's inside, how simple they are and how they work. Now, essentially, an accumulator is just a canister that holds oil that's under pressure. It's basically stored there for when you need it. So if you have some type of oil starvation, so the pickup's not getting any oil due to hard cornering, braking, or acceleration, essentially this stored oil inside the canister gets pushed into your oiling system and it just takes up the slack during that momentary loss in oil pressure, which obviously helps keep your engine alive. Now, we'll use Jet 200 as an example. When we first built the car and entered the World Time Attack back in 2012, we had oil surge in our car. Now, everyone said, go get a dry sump, you're going to get oil surge, even worse, etc., etc., etc. But I thought, you know what? I'll try an accumulator. We installed an accumulator on Jet 200 back then, and we've never had oil pressure surge problems ever since. In fact, we've gone 7 seconds quicker, the G-force is way up on a lot of the corners, and we still don't get oil surge. And why is that? Well, essentially, we're only getting a loss of oil pressure or reduction in oil pressure for a very small amount of time, and there's enough oil inside the accumulator to take up that slack. So we haven't had a problem in that car. Another example is our R32 GT-R. It's had an accumulator in it with a stock bottom end for 5 or 6 years, and the engine was still alive. Did it help? Well, it probably did, because the factory oil pickup quite often gets starved of oil, and when it does, this thing does its job. So how does it work? Well, it's really quite simple. You have a piston, which will normally have a seal around it, that sits inside the canister, and on one side you have compressed air, and on the other side you get oil from the engine. Now, the compressed air side, you're basically putting in a pre-charge. How much air you put in depends on the setup of your engine, or whether you want the oil to come out slowly with low pressure, or whether you want it to come out fast with high pressure. That determines that pre-charge. So you've got air on this side, oil coming from the engine on this side, and obviously as it fills up, you'll see that piston will just move up until the pressure equalises. And when there's a loss of oil pressure on the engine side of things, essentially that compressed air will just push that oil straight back out into the system. Now, what you want to do is, on one end of the accumulator where the oil is, you want to have a shut-off valve or an opening valve of some type. You can either have a manual valve like we have in the 200, or you can have an electric solenoid valve like this, which we have in our GT-R. The only real difference between these is the electronic one means we can remotely operate the accumulator from the driver's seat, or the ECU could do it, or however you want to activate it, while the manual one just means, well, there's never an issue, but you do it yourself from in the car. And we've got that set up in the 200, so you can reach it from the driver's seat. Now, our procedure for using an accumulator is really quite simple. The accumulator will already have stored oil pressure in it from the last time you shut the car down. So what you can do is you can simply open the valve, either by a switch or lever, and you can actually prime your engine. Once you've primed your engine, close it back up, because when you're cranking the car, you don't want to be trying to fill that up at the same time. Get the car running, open the valve up again, it'll refill the accumulator, and you can either then turn it off if you're not doing any performance driving at the time, or it's there ready to go to save your engine. Now, another thing to consider when installing the accumulator into your oiling system is how to put it in. We think it should go before the oil filter. That way, no matter what happens to your oiling system, all the oil goes through the oil filter. But some people put it after the oil filter so it can act as the one-way valve that you need. We've done it by installing a one-way valve, which means that basically that oil pressure coming out of the accumulator can't go backwards or the wrong way. If there's some type of failure of an oil pump, it only goes the correct way and puts the oil where it needs to be. Now, one example of how an accumulator can also save an expensive engine for you is if you have your oil pressure sensor before the accumulator and you were to, say, break an oil pump in a GT-R, your ECU, if you have the correct ECU with engine protection, would detect that drop in oil pressure and then what it would do is it would shut the engine down. But for that momentary couple of moments where you've got no oil pressure and the engine's still running, normally you'd probably do damage to your engine. However, with an accumulator, it would pump oil through the engine, keep the oil going during that time that it takes for the ECU to shut the engine down. So if you broke an oil pump in a GT-R, an accumulator could actually save your engine so that the only damage that you have is the oil pump. So you don't have to go replacing, bent rods and spun bearings and all these other things. So an accumulator can save an engine during something catastrophic like a pump failure. It also picks up the slack during any form of oil surge for in corner, acceleration and braking. And essentially, it's a safety item that could save your engine. So really the question is, why haven't you got one in your car?